Within a week, Russian drones started flooding Polish airspace. Poland quickly followed suit, citing Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty, a measure that highlighted concern and calls for consultations among NATO members. NATO retaliated with strengthened deployments at its eastern edge in an effort to reassure member nations and persuade further attacks. But Russia was not scared of anyone. Drones entered both Poland and Romania the very next day. All of this was happening while Russia and Belarus were running their biggest joint military drill since 2021, which can be seen as an open display of military muscle and aim. Following these failures of deterrence, some experts have argued that NATO might follow from history, possibly Turkey's strategy. In 2015, the so-called Turkish strategy is simple. Blow up any plane the instant it enters your airspace. At first glance, it seems to be effective. Turkey tried it and it worked. When Russian aircraft briefly entered Turkish airspace in 2015, Ankara moved fast. Russia complained, repositioned some of their equipment, but never thought to retaliate, and most importantly, never bothered Turkey again. That event provides a possible model for NATO, but the timing is everything because the world we are living today is so different from 2015. To see why it's helpful to observe and understand the initial event, which is filled with details that mirrors the present conflict. Russia was deeply involved in Syria supporting Bashar al-Assad, who allowed Russia to maintain a naval base at Tartus, which is a valuable warm water port the Kremlin has never given away. Turkey, on the other hand, was supporting bands of rebels in the same chaotic war. The Syrian war was a network of actors with their own goals and agenda, and it would not have taken much effort to make the situation much worse. One of these turning points occurred in June 2012 when a Turkish F-4 Phantom II spy aircraft accidentally entered Syrian airspace in a matter of minutes. It was downed, not accidentally, but due to tension and misinterpretation. Syrian artillery even started shelling Turkish cities. A few months later, the chain of incidents forced Turkey to invoke NATO's Article 4 clause for the second time in history. The same article Poland invoked recently. NATO responded with Operation Act Defense, deploying thousands of troops and millions worth of equipment to the region. On paper, this was a show of force, but in reality, the third-party actors mostly circled around one another, not directly going at each other, but instead dealing with the civil war. There were still glitches along there, like the 2018 incident in which the United States likely bombed Wagner mercenaries, the very same group that would later initiate a riot in Moscow. Another issue more in the Turkish-Pacific narrative took place on November 24, 2015. Two Russian Skoy Su-24M fighter bombers took off from Alium Air Base, which is considered a significant Russian base on the Mediterranean coast of Syria. Bombing sorties out of Qum were now normal, but strategic necessities often had Russia stretched thin. The two planes were flying northeast to target rebel positions, but their trajectory brought them near the Turkish border. Turkey's radar tracked them. The Air Force transmitted repeated warnings, a total of 10 requesting the bombers to turn back. None of these were obeyed. There have been reports to suggest a technical reason the U-24M might not have had the Turkish communication channel available. Because of that, the aircraft crossed the border and Turkish F-16s responded. One Su-24 was downed and crashed into Syrian airspace. Both of the crewmen ejected, but the pilot was killed by Syrian rebels while descending under parachute. The weapons systems operator survived it. Russia deployed helicopters to rescue them, one of which was attacked, killing another infantryman. Russia immediately recovered the debris and analyzed it in Moscow. Political consequences came along as expected. Russian and Turkish foreign ministers had telephonic conversation expressing their outrage. Turkey brought the issue to NATO and the North Atlantic Council intervened to discuss the event in Moscow. The Kremlin, however, put on a similar show, threatening official meetings and a show of military strength. Putin threatened Turkey and relocated some assets. They immediately stationed additional missile systems at KIB and deployed the Mosva toward the coast of Syria. Yet none of it shifted the balance in reality. Turkey was not forced to endure losses or concessions, and Russia did not test Turkish airspace further. History's lesson in this episode is clear. Turkey's zero tolerance policy achieved what Poland and Romania still struggle with today: respect for national airspace. When Russia moved closer to Turkish airspace, the response was fast and successful. The Kremlin came forward, threatened and roared as always, but ultimately the action proved worth it. On the opposite side, Poland's and Romania's recent responses have been measured, reflective, almost beneficial. Poland reportedly shot down a few of the drones, and Romania allowed a drone to cross its borders and simply let it turn back and retreat towards Ukraine. Most analysts indicate that this measured approach will only encourage Russia to continue pushing its borders. An even more threatening policy following Turkey's 2015 move will be a more effective deterrent above all. Standing up for the integrity of your own airspace is a defensive stance, not an attack. Poland and Romania are not being put at much risk in comparison because Russia will not escalate into a full kinetic conflict when it already has its hands full with Ukraine. But although the Turkish strategy looks appealing at first glance, still it isn't without a complexity for beginners. Russia's intent now is different from 2015. Then one or two pilots might have actually made a mistake. Nowadays, the number of drones crossing borders indicates intentional carelessness or even a deliberate attempt to create conflict among NATO members. Unlike Turkey, NATO today has to deal with an ongoing repeated assault, so the Kremlin is more difficult to handle. Second, destroying drones is not always a good idea. Debris could fall on buildings or civilians, turning a defensive measure into a risk. Small drones, in contrast to huge bombers, are dangerous cost-benefit calculation. Destroy them and risk collateral damage, or let them fly and risk the occasional attack. Lastly, there is the cost. The Turkish shoot-down took out a $50 million Su-24M, and human life destroying a $50,000 drone, for example, may be cheaper drone. But the quantities matter. Russia can produce thousands of them by the month. Sending a few dozen through NATO airspace is pennies to them, but they have to defend against it at great cost in fighters, missiles, and radar. For NATO, a Turkey-style response will become very costly, diverting resources from other defense priorities. History gives us lessons overall, but it isn't an ultimate guide. Implementing Turkey's 2015 model in response to today's drone attacks would require careful consideration of intent, safety, and cost. It's simple to demand zero tolerance in today's battlefield. However, it can become too complicated because of cheap drones, large airspace, and budget downturns. One other catch to bringing drones down is their debris. Every time a drone is destroyed in flight, pieces go off in unpredictable directions. That debris can hurt someone, harm something, or create unintended consequences. In some cases, it may be more sensible to let drones continue flying, especially if they are going into sparsely populated areas. And if a drone then returns to Ukraine, well, that's not your problem anymore. Yes, Ukraine is not pleased with the idea of letting some Russian asset roam free even temporarily. But come on, this is often the unfair game of geopolitics where every step is calculated. Consider this versus a manned bomber. You can't just let it pass. A bomber carries a certain payload going to a certain destination and can't just be waved away. Taking it down requires drastic measures, either scrambling aircraft or firing surface-to-air missiles, because not removing it may have catastrophic consequences. And then there is the matter of cost. When Turkey shot down a Russian Su-24M1 pilot was killed, and another easily could have been killed, and that was only one bomber. The aircraft itself cost around $50 million, not to mention the human and political cost. Russia could not have done this kind of thing daily without paying massive financial and diplomatic prices. Drones, on the other hand, constitute a whole different math issue. A standard SHA head drone costs roughly $50,000. Decoys would still be less expensive. Russia does not risk human lives to deploy them, and even during wartime shortages manufactures thousands of them each month. Loss of a few over Poland or Romania means nothing to Moscow. Their gain outweighs their loss. Defending against them is not cheap for NATO either. It costs more than $8,000 to keep a single F-16 in the air for an hour and doesn't even account for the fuel maintenance and ordnance to take out even a few drones. And then there's the Eastern Century Initiative where they deploy Patriot missiles that cost $1 million each. If you liked our video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel.